Okay, so the snare, I've done quite a bit to the snare. I've got my gain staging here, just like on the other one. It's a stereo bus for no reason. It just is. I just often end up with a stereo bus. It doesn't matter whether it is or not because it's just a mono signal. This is a really great plugin. It's one of these things that does things analog can't do. And there's a lot of plugins coming out now that can do some amazing stuff that you can't do at all in the analog world, not even close. And this is one of them. This, it kind of like a super clever limiter gate. It can look at the drums. It understands drums, and it can kind of see the drums almost as samples. And so you can set a level above which the drum won't go. And it's not like a limiter or a compressor where it has to react. And even with a look ahead, it's still going to change the shape of the envelope to some degree or other. And if you limit something, it's always going to sound a bit squashed. But with this thing, it's literally like automating the fader. It's literally like if you'd gone and automated each one. There's absolutely no change to the sound. It's completely transparent. Absolutely amazing as a limiter for drums. But also, you can use it as a gate, and it's the best gate I've ever come across. I used to, and on this one, I don't know if you noticed it, you probably didn't, but we'll go back to the arrangement window. The toms have all been hand-gated, and I'll explain why I did that. And since this plugin came out, no need to hand-gate anything, because it just does it perfectly. If you've ever tried, especially on music like this, using a normal gate, it's not going to work. It's going to be chattering because there's too many tiny details. But that drum leveler can handle almost anything. So after that, we've got, again, the CLA, and because, again, it sounds great on, I love it on kick and snare. I wouldn't say, actually, I like it on overheads. And this, I've got a boost at 5 dB at 2.3 to bring out a bit more, because if you remember, it was lacking detail. And I needed to bring out those frequencies so that you could hear all those tiny little snare things going on. Because a drummer like this, I mean, he's pretty much, the whole idea of is he's kind of almost soloing the entire time. So you've got to hear all those little things going on. And then here I'm cutting at 3.6 dB at 700, because again, it was a little bit boxy sounding. And then I'm boosting 5K here at 142 hertz just to give it a bit more body. And then it is being compressed here with this one has an 1176 or the SSL. It's got both of them built in, and this is a newer modeling of the 1176 by Waves. It's good, and I don't normally use this on things like drums for this kind of music. For rock, absolutely, but for this kind of music, it's usually too heavy-handed. But for some reason on this, just a little touch of it seemed to bring out that detail. So I put a bit of that on, but it's not hitting it too hard, I don't think. I'm just going to play a bit of this before and after. Find that section here. By the way, when this blue light is on, it means, I don't know if you can see that blue light, hopefully you can. Can you see the blue light? Yeah. That means it's engaged, and when the light's off, it's bypassed. Definitely hear more of those little ghost notes going on there. So next in the chain is this, and this is another analog emulation of the Manley Massive Passive EQ, which is a famous EQ in lots of studios, particularly for mastering, but it's also used a lot just in mixing. This is a nice emulation by Native Instruments. I've got a couple of different emulations of it, and I like this one actually. And what the Massive Passive is good at, like I was saying, the SSL is really good for bringing out the kind of drumminess of a drum and the details and the bite and the punch of a drum. The Massive Passive is really good at silkiness on the top end in a way that no other EQ quite does. It also is good at a sweet mid-range, and it's really good at a kind of weight in the low end. It's very easy to make the low end too bloomy with it, but used in the right way, you can add a kind of solidity and weight to the low end that nothing else does the same way. So it's got some unique properties. And on this, I am actually, what am I doing here? I'm adding, again, like a lot of these analog ones, you can boost a lot, and it doesn't sound like you've done much to it. Unlike with a digital EQ, if you boosted like 6 or 7 dB, it'd be like, oh, that sounds artificial. But with these analog ones, you can go a lot further with it, and it, because it's saturating and it's doing other things, and that's a lot of times that's where the good stuff comes from, is getting that nonlinear saturation happening. So that's happening at 180. So that's adding a bit more weight to the low end, and at the top end at 3.9, which is pretty high up there for a snare, I'm adding quite a bit because again I wanted to bring out a bit more detail. So I'll just do a bit of before and after on this one. So this is with. It's just a bit more, you can hear a little bit more detail there. Now I could have boosted that SSL further, but it wouldn't have sounded anything like as good. If you try doing that, it just doesn't sound as good as doing a bit with that and then a bit with another EQ, especially when you're using analog emulations. And that's kind of another one of the kind of themes I was going to return to, is doing little bits with lots of different whatever they are, EQs or compressors or whatever, you tend to get a better result. And the reason is because, especially with analog emulations, each one does something a bit different. It isn't just an EQ like you would get in your stock EQ, DAW EQ, which is just an EQ. Having said that, even those aren't just EQs. All EQs distort the signal just in different ways. And a stock digital EQ definitely distorts the signal. It changes the time domain. It adds ringing, either pre or post ringing, depending on whether it's linear phase. And so it's a matter of like what it does to it. And some of these analog emulations have some special characters to them. They just, for some reason, who knows what's going on, some complicated thing seems to bring out the detail. And another one brings out a bit more bite and a bit more punch, even though you're boosting exactly the same frequency. And then you take a digital EQ and do the same frequency, just doesn't sound the same. Doesn't mean I don't use digital EQs. I use them all the time, but I tend to use them for cuts most of the time. And sometimes for boosts, if I just want a completely clean, when I say clean, it isn't clean, but cleaner kind of boost. So that's what's going on with that. And then finally, I still wasn't getting the detail I needed with all that going on. So I used this compressor here. So I've got 2 compressors going on here. Again, normally in jazz, I wouldn't be doing that. Probably wouldn't even have a compressor on the snare drum in most jazz settings. But in this, you just couldn't hear the snare. So it's getting a little bit more like a rock approach in here, just to hear it all. But again, I'm trying to keep things sound as natural as possible. If it was a rock thing, I'd be doing a whole lot of different things to it. So I'm trying to bring out the detail. So this is a second compressor, and it's got a very long attack, very slow attack, because I wanted to bring out the transients and the attack hits of the snare a bit more. A fast release, because again I wanted it to recover really quickly because the snare's hitting quick. So it's got to come back up quick. So I'll just do a quick before and after on this. Pretty subtle. I'm not sure if I can hear it here, but in a good speakers and a good room, you can definitely hear it. Again, it's just a little bit more detail. And it's back to this thing I was saying a minute ago, just doing a little bit, lots of little moves with a big palette of things. You can get better results, I find, than doing bigger moves with fewer things. And making use of what's unique about each of these things, because they really all sound so different from each other. This one, I don't usually use this on snare. This is, for me, this compressor usually sounds quite lush and elastic sounding is how I describe it. And it can be fantastic on vocals. It can be fantastic on wind instruments. It's quite forgiving and gentle, even with a fair amount of compression. I don't normally like it on drums, but for some reason, I wasn't getting what I needed, and I thought, let's try this. And sure enough, it just seemed to bring out a little bit more detail without actually sounding like you were compressing it, which is what I was after. So then we got a send here going over to a reverb. And so I'll go back again to talk about this creating space thing. There's only reverb on the snare, and this is quite a, it's not that long of a reverb. It's a longish reverb though. And what I wanted to do with it is I just wanted the snare to create a kind of space, help it create the space behind the music, which meant I didn't need to add as much reverb to other things to create that space. I just thought for this particular track, it just wanted to be in a big place. In fact, this whole album is kind of takes place in a big place. And that's, I think, important to think about that when you're doing a track or an album is, what image do you have of the album? Because you need to take an interpretation, either from yourself or from the client. Sometimes a client will say, okay, here's two albums, two tracks, I want my track to sound like this. And then you basically, you try to make it as close to that as you can. And sometimes they throw it over to you and say, I know what you do your thing, come up with it. And then you have to come up with an idea. If you don't have an idea about what you're doing, either from them or from yourself, you're just going to end up getting lost, because you need an overall vision. You need to imagine, oh, it could sound like this. Now, let's see if I can get it to sound like this. So that's one of the things that I always do before I start mixing, is I listen to the unmixed version like you heard and think, based on what it sounds like and what's possible, what could this be potentially? And in a way that, if it's been left up to you, that's down to your personal taste, and it's down to kind of having a vision of some degree of what it could sound like. And for me, this music, because it's so, if you hear the whole album, it is big. There's a lot going on. There's, sometimes there's 6 or 7 gamelons playing at the same time, and there's vocals and samples, things sampled in the field of people singing on islands in Indonesia, all kinds of stuff going on, and it just seems to have this big sound to it. And it also, it's down to knowing the genre. I mean, I know the genre of jazz extremely well, and to me that it reminded me of certain art ensemble of Chicago things. I don't know if you've even heard of that, but they did a lot of stuff in the 70s where they had a lot of interesting stuff going on, and it was on the ECM label, and they had a lot of reverb going on, and it just created this huge space, and it allowed all kinds of stuff to be in this big place somehow. It just seemed to be an atmosphere that made the music work. And to me, this album seemed to sort of sound in that genre somehow. It seemed to fit that. So I think a big space would work. So it's not in a giant space, but it's not a recording that's like in a small club sound at all. That wasn't what was going to work for this, I didn't think. And they liked what I did. So this snare is, this reverb is, it's 2.5 seconds long, something like that. So I'll just see if I can solo that, just so you can hear what that's like. Quite wet, and it's quite big. And that might be totally the wrong thing for another track. It would be totally the wrong thing for another track. You might just want a small, tight room. But for this one, it just seemed to fit with the whole kind of hugeness of the sound. So moving on to the hi-hat. How are we doing for time here? Yeah, we're doing okay. Moving on to the hi-hat. Again, it's gain staged because I'm going through an emulation. Now, this is something which, for jazz, is people have different philosophies on this, and also for other music as well, any kind of acoustic music. And that's high-passing things. And this hi-hat it's high-passed, seriously high-passed. As you can see, all of this has been cut away, and there's a really big boost here. And that's because without this, I'll play you what it sounded like without any of that. Snare. So I couldn't hear the hi-hat at all, and I thought I have to bring out that frequency in amongst all that stuff. Plus, I listened to the snare, and I thought is that a snare sound I would ever use? And I thought, no, that's not a good snare sound. I already had a good snare sound, so I thought, well, why would I want to add that like really crappy snare sound to my nice snare sound? I wouldn't. And so I decided to get rid of all of that. Now, having said that, I never make a rule about that, because sometimes it sounds absolutely great without any high passing or anything, and the drums just sound good as they are. So I always start with that and think, how are the drums sounding? Do they sound really good? And I start muting the channels one at a time and see how it changes it. And if it takes away and it loses something, I'm not going to start high passing. But if I add in, for example, here I added in the hi-hat to the drum kit, didn't improve it at all, and it just seemed to muddy it up. So to me, that's an immediate candidate for high passing, and especially when you have a listen to it, you think it's not a very nice sound. And also, I think you have to think about, why would you want the other sounds coming through mics? And again, I think it comes down to a room. If it's been recorded in a beautiful sounding room or a really great sounding drum room, all the mics are picking up all of those reflections. And the reflections are coming back into the drums and vibrating the drums. It's all like a big, almost organic feedback of sound. And so you get a little bit of that through all the mics. So you don't really want to take all that away by high passing and gating everything. But again, in a situation, and so it's, if it's recorded in a really great sounding drum room or whatever great sounding room it was, then I probably wouldn't do any of this. But in most modern situations, it's not. It's recorded in a really small drum room. It's very deadened, and you don't have a lot of that information. So all you're really, in the end, you're not getting wonderful reflections coming in. You're just getting kind of crappy, second-rate sounds of all the drums being added into your main drum. So that's why this has been high pass and heavily boosted here, because just weren't hearing it. The mic was not well placed. Had the mic been placed better, I wouldn't need to do that, but it was not. And then it needed a bit of sweetening, and so it's got quite a big boost here at 5.6K with this massive passive, which is just, again, it's nice for kind of cymbal-y things, I find. And I'm pretty much boosting the same thing I already boosted with the Fab filter, which is like a digital EQ, clean EQ. So like, why would I do the same thing twice? And it's just because in the end you're just turning the volume up. Well, you would be just turning the volume up, except this is doing a whole lot of other stuff. And it just sweetens it. It just sounds nicer, especially in the whole mix with everything. So that is what that's doing. And then let's see, moving under the toms, they're all subgrouped. And here, what I've got is something I often use. I like to hear the stick on the skin of the tom, and oftentimes you don't really hear that very well. So this is a dynamic EQ. It's in expanding mode, so that when the drumstick hits and crosses a threshold, it boosts that EQ, and it's quite it's, how long is it here? It's 50 milliseconds, so it's just really the attack and a little bit more that gets boosted, and then it comes back down. So it's not, if I just did a static EQ boost, it would affect the whole tom sound, which I didn't want to do. I just wanted that stick sound a little bit more present, and so that's what that's for. And then this is just a fix. There was a resonance that needed to go. So this is just a clean EQ and a bit of low end added there. And then the overheads. So overheads are another one where I think it's really depends on the style of music, hugely, what you do with overheads. With this kind of music, because the ride cymbal particularly is so important to the whole thing, it's actually not really hearing that much. But in a lot of the tracks on this album, the ride cymbal is like a really intricate pattern, and everybody's playing off of that. So you've got to hear it really clearly. And if you have your overheads high up, like you would with a lot of styles of music, you're never going to hear that in detail. Even by the time you've boosted it up, you'll have boosted up the snare to the point where the snare is too loud. So for something like this, you've got to get the mics right down over the cymbals, like, this as close as you can get them without there being any danger of the cymbal flapping back and hitting the mic. And for that reason, it's not really the same as overheads which are higher up, which are getting like a whole picture of the kit. And so I wasn't worried about that. I mean, if I had high, it was a different kind of music, and you're trying to get a picture of the whole kit with overheads at a good height, you don't want to a lot of the sound of the kit, including everything, all the low end, might also be coming through that as something you really want. But in this case, because the cymbals were the target, I didn't want all that low end information coming through here. And again, I listened to it, didn't think the sound I was getting from the low end of the snare and the kick drum was adding anything when I muted it and unmuted it, listening to the whole drum kit. And so I decided to high pass this here, as you can see. So again, something I often do, but it's also something I often don't do. It just depends on the style of music. For this, it definitely cleaned it all up a lot and allowed me to bring up those cymbals louder without also bringing up the snare and the kick. And then I did something really unusual that I almost never do, and that is I EQ'd one side of the overhead pair, and that's generally, I would normally never do that. Because, when you're miking up, it's really important to get the phase differences right, so you need to measure from the two mics to the center of the snare. And that's partly for the phase, but it's also partly because you don't want to smear the snare. If you have the snare coming in a little off center through your overheads, and then you've got your direct snare mic and they're not lined up, you're going to get a kind of smearing of the snare sound. So you've got to be a bit careful about that. And EQing one side is in danger of messing with that. But what I found was I just wasn't getting enough detail on the ride cymbal. And so I thought, well, I'll try it. And this is a parallel EQ, which adds a bit less of a problem than a normal EQ would. It's also an EQ that always sounds really fantastic, I find, on cymbals. And it didn't seem to disturb the snare at all. So I put it on one side, but it's something that I almost never do. And then the overheads go into a subgroup, and there I've got that high pass I showed you. I've got another one of these, again, just to bring out this EQ, just something about it. It just brings out what I like to hear in cymbals. It brings out that swishy thing without it sounding harsh. It's a great EQ for that. And then I've got another one of these, which I know I'm really overusing on this, but to be honest, the reason I'm using this all the time is because it's very low CPU. There's a lot of plugins I use from a company called Acoustica Audio that use a really different type of, not modeling, but they actually sample the hardware with loads and loads and loads of impulse responses. I don't know, hundreds of them, many of them, and it morphs between those, and it's a very different way of getting the sound of hardware, and some of them just sound really fantastically great. And I've got a massive passive from that, which also sounds wonderful. I often use, but the CPU wouldn't play back. So, but this sounds good. And I often use this too, but the reason I'm using this every time is because of that. So then it goes into a drum sub. So I've got the whole drums here being controlled by one, including all the reverbs. Another thing, just a quick thing, maybe going too far off topic here, but you've got to be really careful about doing subgroups and thinking about whether to use a VCA or whether to use an aux, because if you do it wrong, I'm not going to go into the details, it's just worth thinking about this, because if you do it wrong, you can end up turning your drums down, but then the reverbs don't go down. And that kind of weird stuff can happen. So just important to make a decision about, for me, you could get around that using a VCA. I tend to just put everything into a subgroup, including all the drum reverbs and everything. And that works most of the time. Occasionally it doesn't, because I've got something else going into the drum reverb from elsewhere, but in which case I probably would use VCAs for that.